If you have a story you'd like to hear on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. And of course, thank you. About 10 or so years ago, I had a stint in my life where I was really lonely, though I think maybe desperate is the better word. I guess I should say that I've had a few serious relationships throughout my life, but I hit 30 and hit a major level of depression because the man that I thought was going to be my husband decided he wasn't ready for commitment and we went our separate ways. This was about a 4-year relationship, mind you, and while he said it was commitment issues, I'm pretty sure he was just wanting to see someone else. It is what it is, and sure, I'm bitter about it, but I have to accept it and move on. He's not who this story is about. Sorry for the tangent. Anyways, so I was just out of that relationship, and then I turned 30 about 2 months later. And as I mentioned, I hit a pretty bad low in my life. I was in that I need companionship now mentality, and I immediately leaned into making a profile for one of them online dating sites back then. I don't remember which one. It was whichever one was most popular back in 2011, probably Plenty of Fish, but I remember it being a bit confusing. That and it kept trying to match me with people that were nothing like me. Nothing like reading a bio that it suggested and have it be the polar opposite of yourself. I know opposites attract, but when it says no tall women, no women that like Harry Potter, and my bio literally mentions that I'm taller than average and a huge Potter lover, it almost feels like a joke. So after scrolling through all the BS, matching with a couple guys, messaging a few people, and really feeling like this was all a hopeless venture, I found a guy named Dan. Dan was exactly what I wanted in a man physically, and all his interests seemed to line up with mine. He had long black hair, looked to be taller than me, which was nice, although never a deal breaker, and all of his pictures had him wearing some pop culture referencing t-shirt that told me he was absolutely into the things I was into. I marked that I was interested, just hoping that he would mark the same on me, and much to my pleasure, he did. I instantly sent him a DM and started off with something corny like, "Your hair is gorgeous. I wish I could get mine to be as shiny and straight as yours." I know, dumb, but I was actually kind of jealous. He actually responded almost immediately with some joke response about how he had made a deal with the devil to have his hair like his. His off-kilter humor was actually one of the things that made me really like him, and I was excited to get to know him. I may have been desperate, like I mentioned before, but something in my heart was telling me that Dan could be the one. Like he could be exactly what I was looking for, and maybe we had a future together. Having these thoughts after just a few conversations may not be healthy, but there was really something just about him. We ended up talking on the phone a few times, and I started liking him even more. He had a beautiful singing voice. He told me he used to be in a band that was kind of popular locally, but never went anywhere on the big stages. He told me that his last job was actually at an animal clinic where he was tasked with keeping the animals company if they had to stay overnight or needed to be taken care of outside of the normal medical work. The more he told me, the more I absolutely adored this man. And after a while, I started having this weird nagging feeling in my mind. Why was he single? He was attractive, talented, entertaining, and loved animals. He was overall a really great and interesting guy, so why had no one scooped him up and put a ring on his finger? I actually brought this up, and he mentioned to me that things were complicated. I asked how complicated, mostly because that wasn't an answer I was looking forward to. He responds by saying that he had a wife and that things had recently gone sour, so he no longer had a wife. That kind of made sense to me. He was married and things went bad, so he was out looking for someone else to fill the gap. I could relate. We ended up talking about our past relationships, or more so, I ended up talking about mine. He seemed a bit evasive, but I just assumed that he wasn't really feeling up to discussing it because it was so recent. I was okay with that. It was nice to vent out some of my frustrations, and he was really good at listening and helping me see things more clearly. Then the big day arrived. We had agreed to meet up for coffee on a Saturday morning at a local coffee shop. I got there and he was already seated in the back waiting for me. It was actually really nice to meet him in person. He looked just like his photos. He had the same personality. He was the same funny and entertaining guy that I had come to know over these past couple weeks. This was actually a huge relief because I was worried I was going to get catfished. We enjoyed our coffee and companionship for a few hours, and then I had mentioned that it was getting to be midday and that I should probably be getting home at some point, but that I would absolutely love to meet up again and have dinner or something. This is when he mentioned to me that he had a great time as well, and then he kind of shyly looked down at the floor like something was wrong. I asked if he was okay, and he looked up and mentioned that he needed to ask me a favor. I said of course, not really thinking about what the favor could be, but he then mentioned that he actually needed me to give him a ride somewhere if I could. I realized that he was already there when I got in, so I hadn't seen him pull up, and he actually seemed rather embarrassed at this request, which was almost cute. At this point, I felt comfortable with him enough that having him in my car, driving him a few blocks to his apartment, wasn't really that big of a deal. Plus, I was honestly thinking this could be a long-term thing if it kept up like it had, so I was more than willing to do so. I told him that was fine, and just kind of mentioned that I didn't know that he didn't have a car, and mentioned that he didn't need to be embarrassed about it. He thanked me, and we headed out to my car, and we went to get him home. As we were driving and he was pointing out where to turn, he started telling me more about his past and about how things had been rough recently. I asked if the divorce had been a bad one, and he then dropped a bombshell. He mentioned that he and his wife actually hadn't gotten divorced. This killed me inside, and it made things make more sense. He wasn't actually divorced. He was still married. Sure, they could have been separated, but if he wasn't divorced, then it was likely that they could get back together or try to fix things, and there'd be no room for me in Dan's life. I kind of shut down a bit after this, and just listened to him tell me about how bad things were between him and his wife, and not really paying attention to where he was telling me to go. Then he had me turn one more time, a turn into the parking lot of a police station. I parked and just kind of looked around confused and asked why we were at the police station. It was then that he went really quiet and just sort of looked at the building and away from me. This whole situation was really weird, and I was honestly starting to feel freaked out. This is when Dan looked over at me and said that he really enjoyed the short time that we had together, and said that I was a lovely lady and that he was certain I would find someone. He then said that he was about to go into the station and confess to doing something that was really, really bad, and that he was going to go to prison, most likely for the rest of his life, and that if things had gone differently, he would have loved to have spent more time with me. I asked what he had done, what he was talking about, and he just sighed and said that it was an accident, that he never actually meant to hurt anyone, and then pushed my door open and walked into the building. I just sat there, watching him walk into the department with his head held high and stop at the front desk. I watched the whole thing play out from right there, watched him talk to the desk clerk, watched an officer walk up to him cautiously, and then watched as the officer put cuffs on him and pulled him away from the desk. A few minutes later, another officer actually walked out to my car and spoke with me. He asked me if I knew the man that had just walked in, how I knew him, if I knew what had happened. I told him that we had just met a couple of weeks ago and that we'd gone on our first date just that morning. I was more or less interrogated by this officer in the parking lot about Dan, and I told him all I knew. And he told me that Dan had just walked in and told them that he needed to confess to murdering his wife. I obviously didn't know anything about that. I had thought he was divorced. After a bit more talking, they gave me a card, took my info, and then let me leave. At this point, it was a little more clear to me how Dan had a wife, past tense, but wasn't divorced. And then it occurred to me that I'd had coffee with a murderer and even drove him to the station to turn himself in. I really don't know if our date was just him getting a free coffee and then a ride to the station, or if he was really interested in me. But either way, it was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. Not because he was a creep to me, but because he was perfectly normal the whole time we spoke during our date. This man was a murderer, but he seemed like a calm and complacent guy that was all there. That was just a normal person. This was the only time I ever went on a date with someone I met online, and I actually shut down my account after that. To start the story off, it's probably best that I give some context. I am currently a 30-year-old woman and am married with a kid. Back when this took place in 2015, I was 25 and hadn't met my husband. I've always been a fairly small woman, like just under 5 foot, and rather skinny. On top of this, to say that I've always looked really young is an understatement. I 100% have a baby face. Back when I would use dating apps like Tinder and all the other ones that I honestly can't remember, I would constantly get messages from guys asking me how old I was, despite the fact that it was a prominent part of my bio that I was well into my 20s. I would tell them how old I was, and sometimes they would reply joking about how I looked like I was no older than 14. Sometimes the responses would go from these jokes to the level of super creep, and the guys would comment at how attracted they were to the fact that I looked like a teenager. One time, I got a guy that seriously messaged me telling me what he wanted to do to my childlike face. Yeah, he used those words exactly. Childlike. Let me tell you, nothing gets us ladies going like knowing that a guy is a legit pedo creeper. I would just respond to the weirdos by saying that I was reporting them to the authorities and then block them. It was mostly an empty threat, really, but looking back, I probably should have reported some of them. I'm sure the FBI could have found something on them. I hope I at least gave some of them enough of a scare to screw off and leave people alone. So obviously, being a petite and young-looking woman, but being of legal age, attracted some of the very best men out there. That part should be apparent. There were a few guys that I matched with that weren't super creeps, but those never really went anywhere. And for the most part, we mutually moved on after there wasn't much of a connection. Honestly, I had very little luck with online dating, and I was pretty much just perusing the apps for the fun of it by the time this happened. I had been talking to people on Tinder for around 8 months, and not one of them had really made much of an impression. Then, as would be expected with me at the end of my rope with people and ready to uninstall the app permanently, I get a message from a guy I matched with named Trevor. I honestly don't remember why I swiped on him. I was probably in one of those weird mindsets where I just swiped on everyone, and it happened more than I'd like to admit. Anyways, I get a pretty normal message from Trevor. It basically just says, "Hey, you're really pretty," and that's about it. At first, I was going to ignore it, mostly because it was pretty generic, but then I figured, why not give this guy a try? I told him thank you, and then asked if he only swiped on me because he thought I was attractive. He said that was one reason, but he actually matched with me because I mentioned how much I loved Ryan Reynolds as an actor in my profile. I had honestly forgotten what my profile said, but this response actually got a chuckle out of me. We talked for a while through messages, and just spent a bit of time getting to know each other. Overall, the conversations went pretty normal, and there weren't any red flags that I could see when we chatted. After a few days of messages, a few days of texts, and then a couple phone calls, we decided that we wanted to meet up for our first date. I was pretty excited. He seemed like a nice guy, and we had agreed to meet up at a local coffee shop that was a couple miles from my place. Overall, it seemed like it was going to be a pretty normal meetup. The night got here, and we met up at the coffee house. The conversation while we had our coffee seemed incredibly genuine. There was nothing about it that made me think anything was wrong with the situation. We spoke about ourselves, who we were, what we did, basically the things that people just getting to know each other conversed about. After we finished our coffee, he made a comment that he wasn't really ready to head home yet, and that he wanted to go to the park to watch the sunset. Honestly, this was one of those comments that absolutely won me over. I loved the idea of ending a first date watching the sunset in a park. We got up and walked outside, and he mentioned that he could drive us there if I didn't want to follow him. I kind of paused when he mentioned this. I started to hear a bit of an alarm bell in my head, but at the same time, I was sitting there thinking that this guy was pretty normal, and I'd had a great time. I asked him how far it was, and he told me it was literally just a couple blocks away. And for some stupid reason, I decided this was a good enough response for me to go with him. So we walked out to the parking lot, and I got into the passenger seat of his truck. He had an old Toyota Tacoma with a camper cover on the bed, which really didn't stand out as anything important to me at the time. We drove off and out of the parking lot, and he started to talk to me about random things. He asked me about what I did for work. I told him that I was working at an office as an admin assist, which was true. He asked about my parents, if I had any siblings, asked me if I had any roommates, and in my ignorance, I actually told him all about myself. I told him that my father had passed away a few years back, that I didn't have any siblings, and that I only had one roommate. At first, I was a bit confused on why he was randomly asking these questions now, and not earlier when we were getting to know each other. Then it clicked, mostly because I didn't realize that we had been driving for a while, much further than a couple blocks. He was pretty much asking me about my home life to see if anyone would notice if I didn't come home, and he was asking the questions rapidly like this to distract me. What's worse is that I pretty much told him everything he needed to hear. I felt like I was about to have a panic attack for a moment when it all fell into place, but I kept my calm and took a few deep breaths, all the while focusing everything around us. I then decided to ask him where the park was that we were going to. He chuckled a bit and told me that it was just down the road. I said okay and was taking in everything around me. After a few more moments, he pulls the car into what appeared to be an abandoned lot for a building, just without the building. Basically, it was an empty parking lot with a cement base for a building, but it was completely and totally abandoned. I asked him why we were here, and again, he chuckled before looking over at me. He then said, "Look, we both know why we're here, and I don't want to hurt you. So if you just go along with it, it'll go a lot easier." And then he started to reach down and undo his pants. I was horrified, and I'd guess it was obvious based on him laughing at me. He then started talking again. "Look, I have a knife in my door on this side if you want to do this the hard way. I'd rather just get it over with and take you back to your car and move on." He stared at me with a serious look and motioned towards himself. Then he made the mistake of trying to put his hand on my face to pull me closer. As soon as his hand got close to my face, I opened my mouth and latched on to one of his fingers. I bit down as hard as I could, and I kept pushing my jaw together as hard as I possibly could. If it tells you anything, I bit his finger so hard that I felt bone against my teeth. I could taste the blood from his finger as I ripped into the skin. His scream was seriously blood-curdling, and I'm just glad he focused more on me ripping his finger halfway off than he was with the knife that he claimed to have. Obviously, I didn't know if he actually had one, but I had to assume he did. After a few seconds that felt like forever, I let go of his finger and quickly threw the door open, and I ran in the direction of the closest house. As I ran off, I saw him start the truck and drive off, screeching the tires on the asphalt as he gunned it away from the area. When the person answered the door, I explained to them what had happened and asked them to call the cops. Honestly, as crazy as it may sound, I had completely forgotten that I even had a cell phone in my purse. I was shaking and running on adrenaline to the point that I was basically just yelling at this random person, asking them to call the cops for me. When the cops showed up, I explained to them the whole situation. I told them that it was a first date and that everything was normal, and then told them about how he said he was supposed to be taking me to the park, but ended up taking me to this parking lot. I then explained that he had threatened me and that he attempted to sexually assault me. I described the truck to them and told them which way he went, and then I told them that I had practically bitten off one of his fingers. In the end, there wasn't much that could be done, mostly because he was long gone, and there was no real proof of what happened. The cops drove me back to my car, and they told me that they would follow up with me if anything happened. They never got back with me, so I have to assume nothing did. The only real positive that came out of this was that I learned it was possible to pretty much bite through someone's finger, and I'm pretty sure he'll never forget me. Hopefully, he never tried this again, and I can only hope I was the only person he had ever tried this with. In the end, I deleted my profile and blocked his number, and moved on from the whole thing as best I could. It could have been much worse, and I'm thankful it didn't. Thankfully, as I said earlier, I am now married and have a very happy life, and I plan to keep it that way. So, Trevor, I hope your finger never healed, and also, let's never meet again, you absolute creep. I actually have 2 dating stories that should be pretty quick, hopefully, and they're not necessarily horror as in scary, but they're horror in the sense that they were horrifying and turned me off of online dating pretty much altogether. I don't think much backstory is really needed for me, beyond the fact that I was in my mid-20s, have never had a luck with meeting people that I care to really spend time with, and I wasn't exactly picky on who I swiped matched on. When I say I wasn't picky, I mean that as long as they were a guy above a 3 on a scale of 10, and didn't throw out any major super creep vibes, I was pretty much willing to give them a try. I know this may have been really dumb, but I'm the kind of person that is really willing to give anyone a shot to see if we vibe, if that makes sense. Anyways, on to the first date story. I had matched with a guy named Jake on one of the apps, and he seemed like a pretty straightforward guy. His profile was pretty much your basic mid-20s guy that was into tech and fitness, two things that were actually bonuses for me. He and I spoke for a while, sent a few photos, had a few phone calls, and he was pretty much the most normal guy I had ever spoken with. I was totally okay with normal. In fact, that was what I was looking for more than anything. We agreed to meet up for lunch at a small diner-like restaurant and set a date. The day comes, I show up first and get the table for the two of us. As I'm sitting there, just waiting, I get a text from Jake saying that he's had some car trouble and that he's going to be a few minutes late, but he was 100% not ghosting me. That was fine with me. I get it. I've had my share of why won't my rust bucket start moments. I tell him I'm at the table and that it's totally fine and that I understand, and so forth and so on. After about 20 or so more minutes, he finally walks into the restaurant and to our table, but he looks like he's just had a panic attack. He was sweating and it was early spring, so it was still pretty chilly outside, and he just looked distressed and disheveled overall. He sits down and immediately just kind of looks like he's lost all sense of the situation. Like something happened and he's freaking out, but can't make it not obvious that he's freaking out. I ask him if he's okay and what was going on, and he just kind of starts looking like he's about to start sobbing. As soon as that happens, I hear shouting and see several cops running into the restaurant, telling him to get down on his knees and arresting him. It took me a few minutes to convince them that I was already there at the restaurant and that I was not with him prior to the minute he walked in. Thankfully, the host and server could vouch for me on that though. Come to find out, on his way to the date, Mr. Jake had actually hit someone with his car and then kept going. I don't mean like he sideswiped or bumped someone else's car. I mean that he literally hit a person and ran over their leg, causing major injury, and then kept going to meet up with me at the restaurant. I'm assuming I was supposed to be an alibi, or I would have been if he hadn't been looked for by the police. So obviously that date ended pretty quickly, with him being shoved in the back of a cruiser and me just staring at the floor like, what am I doing with my life? Thankfully, the waiter was sympathetic and didn't make me pay for my drink, which was nice. At least I got a free Dr. Pepper out of the situation. The second one is the one that's not necessarily scary, but it's still what I would consider a dating horror story. It was, once again, a story where I met up with a guy that I met on one of the dating apps. This one was a guy named Chris. Chris's profile was a bit above the others that I looked at on the apps, because Chris was actually pretty attractive and was all about staying fit, as he was former military. Now, I've never been with a military guy, but I know a few of them, my brother for one, and I found most of them to be fairly tolerable and even fun to hang out with. Talking with Chris went pretty smoothly at first, though he seemed to have a really strict, I can't chat with you before 8 p.m. kind of schedule about him, which had me initially concerned that he may have been married, looking for an affair. I figured I would at least see it through to the first date and see if I could spot an indentation on his ring finger or try to ask him what it was all about. I mean, it could have been that he had a job that he worked until then and he couldn't have his phone, or maybe he just had other adult responsibilities he had to see to. I was willing to be patient with him and get answers, so we scheduled a date for dinner. That 8 p.m. rule made it hard to do anything else, and I was looking forward to it. Once again, I was early to the date, and I got a table for us. Then, when he finally shows up to the date, he walks in with another woman. I was a bit confused and taken aback that he would have the audacity to bring someone else to the date like that. But it was even more awkward when he sat down and said, "It's very nice to finally meet you in person. This is my mother." This man literally brought his mother on the date without warning. Now, mind you, if his mother had needed his care or been disabled, I would have had no issue with it, assuming he would have informed me beforehand. But this woman was quite fit and quite able to take care of herself, and she was definitely there because she wanted to be there. What was weirder, at no point did Chris act like this was a weird thing. He just kept up the conversation as if she wasn't there. Then it hit the apex of, oh my god, this is so awkward. When it came time to order food, he tried to order one thing and his mother told him no, then told the waiter something else. When the waiter walked away, he tried to tell his mom that he wanted the other thing, almost whining like a little kid, but she told him that it was too fatty and that he needed to watch his carbs. I just kind of sat there like, what? Was this woman really ordering for her adult, former military son like this while he was on a date? Again, I know this wasn't scary, but it was definitely my nope, I'm done moment. The entire date was so strange, and I pretty much ghosted him after this. I tried to think that maybe I was just being shallow about the whole thing, but it was too much. Chris was actually my last date through any of those apps, and I kind of embraced being single for a while for reasons that I think are pretty obvious. So that, my friends, was a collection of first date stories. At least the last one was a little bit of a cleanser, not as creepy, but equally just as bad, I guess. That's kind of awkward and embarrassing. I think our first date was to go see the Simpsons movie. Mm-hmm. That was normal. Nobody got hit or anything, so I don't have any crazy tales there either. Sorry. Anyways, if you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts. Let me know if you had any weird dates. Could be creepy, could just be an event that you remember that was not normal. And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic week. And until next time, take care.